It's a strange story. It started organically and it almost just started itself. So prior to starting Digital Music News, I was in the music industry. I was at Sony Music Entertainment, and then I was in music technology. And during that time, a lot of what I was doing was trying to figure out what was going on in music technology. There's nobody writing about it. And I was trying to work with companies. Sometimes the company I was with was investing in companies, partnering with them, all in the music tech space. And there were so many issues. There were issues related to formats, copyright, DRM, artists' willingness to embrace technology, all these issues, financials, investment. And I was trying to keep track of it, and I started to develop these ways to organize all the information that wasn't out there. And I started to develop a community of other executives who needed to do the same thing, and I was just updating them on what I was finding out and trying to share information. Until every morning I was just sending them information on companies. And it just kept growing and growing. And then I said, well, I'm gonna actually pretend that I'm like the Wall Street Journal here. I'm just gonna write articles for 2 hours every morning. And I would just get in early and do that. And then go back to whatever else I was working on. And then it just grew and grew and grew to the point that I realized, wow, this was a market need. And then it just kept evolving from there. It was. If you look back, going way back to, let's say, 2005, okay, let's go back 20 years, 2004. The music industry as a hub was starting to shift at that point more and more to Los Angeles. So there was a point in time where it wasn't quite clear in the United States where the hub for the music industry was ultimately going to be. Was it going to be New York? Would it be Atlanta? Atlanta is still, of course, today a very important hub for music, but where was the biggest one? And LA kept growing. Right here in Santa Monica, you have Universal Music Groups. Right next door, you have Sony Music Publishing. All of these giants were gravitating towards Los Angeles, and then a lot of the big heavyweights like Lucian Grange now in Los Angeles. So it started to migrate. And so for that reason, I just found myself here all the time. And so I was thinking, okay, let's just camp out here, and eventually it just made sense to live here. Yeah, it's funny, we were just upstairs, I was playing the bass for you, so just electric bass, but my main instrument growing up and throughout my life has been the French horn. The French horn is literally where I got my chops musically. It gave me so many opportunities to grow as a young person musically, because what I found is I personally love the French horn, but it wasn't the most popular instrument. So basically, by being good at this instrument, I could basically get into any orchestra. So it put me in a competitive place where I was with a lot of really good musicians, and I was just playing all the time. And I could travel. Sometimes I was getting paid as just like a teenager to travel with an orchestra. I remember I was getting called up to playing gigs in Washington for like paid performances, like operas and stuff like that. And I was just sitting in there. I definitely didn't deserve to be in there, but sometimes one of the French horn players who I knew, who was teaching me a lot, he wasn't my main teacher, but he knew me. He was like helping me develop. He had a baby one morning or something, and that was the matinee of the show was coming up, and he called me. He's like, I really need you to just sit in on this. Can you do it? And I did it. And my father drove me down to the theater. I'm trying to remember where exactly. It was kind of like George Washington University or something like that. And I remember asking my father, like, this is crazy. Can I do this? And he's like, you should do it. Just go. And I was sitting in the pit, and there was like this paid audience. And yeah, so I was getting a lot of opportunities. So it was great. It was great. It was a really good instrument to grow up on, in my opinion. So I listened to a ton of classical music, and I would say within classical, I would say I listen to what I might call classical. So stuff from Austria, basically, a lot of 18th century stuff, just the iconic greats. I listen to a ton of Mozart, ton of Beethoven. Vivaldi is absolutely one of my hands down favorites. Of course, huge artists. The list goes on and on. Bach, Handel, endless classical artists. I also like romantic artists. I love I guess what I might call like impressionist musical artists as well, all classical. So a lot of classical. But then I just love smattering in all kinds of different categories. And I guess I'm a little less committal on the specific genre, but it can span rock, house, techno, regional Mexican music. Usually it's just a smattering of all kinds of different genres. Oh my gosh. There's quite a lot of very weird stories that have happened. I guess there's a lot of very weird kind of beefs and debates that come around. I'll tell you the funniest one was when BTS, the K-pop giant group, started emerging. I guess it was around 2014, 2015. They were just starting to, at some point, cross into the United States. I would say the funniest thing that happened was we started covering this. We're like, wow, this is a big new trend. This is K-pop. This is what's going on. Let's cover, of course, BTS, the biggest group. And I put on my analytical hat and I started asking some kind of tough questions about BTS. And one of them was, are these guys like, what amount of plastic surgery are these guys doing, right? Well, how much? And I was thinking, this is kind of funny. And I remember I got so interested in this topic. I started writing about it, and I noticed our comment section for these articles would be like 100+ comments within like the first few hours, and none of it was anyone I knew or recognized. It was the BTS army, okay? And then I thought, this is really interesting. Do these guys have plastic surgery? And so we're close. Beverly Hills is one of the most important places for plastic surgery in the world. So I said, why don't I try to find someone there who can answer the question? And I actually met a really good plastic surgeon who actually went through the pictures. He actually took the time and gave his expert opinion on what work each one of the members of BTS had. I'm like, well, there's your answer, right? This is an expert going through. Most of the guys, in his opinion, had some work. But he also said that a lot of them were using a lot of cosmetics and other areas that you might think is plastic surgery, but it's not. And then another guy, like I think there were 2 members where he said, no, their faces are already like dolls, they're perfect. And so we published that article. I think that was probably the biggest article in our history. And from an industry standpoint, we were trying to think like, is this gonna translate to America? Does this idea translate to America? We know it did. But back then it was unclear. Like was that a style that was going to work? So it was really just an industry question that I was addressing to the music industry. But then I would say I got my first hate mail at that point. No death threats, but I did get some pretty interesting letters where people were very unhappy. There were a lot of armies were trying to get me sued. So they wanted Big Hit Entertainment, which represents the label behind BTS, to sue me. And there was definitely some threats that happened there. I would say the whole thing gave me a big laugh, but probably the funniest moment I had. Yeah, so there is one that easily stands out. So we actually got sued and were involved in a pretty lengthy and contentious lawsuit, actually with a company that is no longer in business. So there's a company out of Florida called Groove Shark. So Groove Shark, we're covering them very intently. And Groove Shark was emerging in a very formative period for the music industry. So it's before Spotify, had the, 250+ paying subscribers and the hundreds of millions of monthly active users and 500 million paying subscribers and streaming. It was way before all of that happened. And Groove Shark emerged as this sort of user-friendly version, I would say maybe of Kazaa or something like that, where the interface was very friendly, kind of looked like iTunes, maybe an early predecessor version of Spotify, but they were actually fighting to have this decentralized version of an app for music become legal. A lot of artists were really pissed off about it. So we actually were talking to a lot of artists who were asking us if they could express their frustration trying to get their music off of Groove Shark. And meanwhile, there were separate legal battles going on like crazy. So we published one by the lead singer of King Crimson, who wrote an enormously long piece about how his music couldn't be removed from Groove Shark. And in the comment section, is where a lot of information started coming out. The whole lawsuit was over Groove Shark trying to force me to disclose the identity of commenters. And they were doing that because they were getting sued by Universal Music Group, and they wanted to know who was leaking this information in our comment section. So for about 2 to 3 years, maybe 3+ years of my life, I was battling litigation from Groove Shark. And then eventually Groove Shark lost, they went out of business. But yeah, that was probably the most contentious episode we've had as a publication. Yeah, there's actually, unfortunately, a lot of sadness in the business, I would say. There are horrible situations that come up. I guess there's horrible situations that come up in the world, but because music is so emotional and it brings so many people together, sometimes that just goes so badly. The Astroworld catastrophe with Travis Scott, I mean, we're still in the middle of all this litigation about it, but when you get past the lawsuits and this and that and who's liable, and there's just some very, very sad stories. 10, 11, 12 people died in this concert, and they had no idea they were going to die that day. Obviously, they were just going to see, their favorite rapper. But yeah, that was a tremendously heartbreaking, sad story. And then there's also some really sad stories sometimes when you see tragedies on the artistic side. Some of the most successful artists I found, they're very much different animals. They're so creative, so in touch with their creativity, and that there's a dark side to that often. And so you do see artists succumbing to alcohol abuse, violence, all kinds of really treacherous and bad things. So it can be very tragic. Oftentimes, an artist does face a tragic ending. We've seen it over history. So those are the sad stories, I think. So the space is way more competitive than you would imagine. Way more competitive. I think that there was a period in the music industry when everything was crashing, falling apart. It was very scary. A lot of people lost their jobs, and a lot of people were really worried about not just the future of their jobs, the future of their companies and sectors. So in that period, I think we were emerging more as tech-focused, disruptive, focused on disruption. We had a really good connection to the tech community, which was intent on sort of reshaping the model a bit, which ended up happening. So I think then is when we really were getting on the scene. But now what's exciting to me is that we have a lot of intense competitors who are all reporting different things, different angles, have different approaches. And that's great news for us, because now it's almost like we show up every day and it's a wrestling match between 3 or 4 different publications, which is so encouraging to me, because I've realized, wow, all these publications are bringing A games. Every once in a while, we're doing the scooping, we're getting the best story. I'd like to think we do that more often, but not always. Other publications have their sources too. But it just shows me that the industry is growing and growing and growing, and it's supporting multiple publications. And so for me, it means that we have to be absolutely on our game. Like, we rose up, but now it's an incredibly competitive landscape, and other publications have done a great job like building themselves up too. So that's the answer. It's a very competitive space now. I'll tell you what we're thinking is next. Okay, so what is missing in the music industry? In some ways, it's so nice to see the industry having recovered and having such a robust recording, publishing, and live touring industry. We're actually in a very good spot. Of course, things are changing so quickly. We don't know what things are going to look like in 5 years, 10 years. It might be double the size, it might be half the size, hard to tell. But for us, we've decided that we want to help make this industry like other mature industries. So if you go into other mature industries, let's just say the automotive industry or oil and gas or healthcare, these are industries that have more robust informational support structures. That was a complicated way of saying that there's better data, there's more information, more research. They've been around, and they're bigger industries actually, but they have a lot more infrastructure informationally. So it's not just news. It's going to be data on where money is flowing, trends in healthcare. You could find lots of different information on different areas of healthcare, medicine, funding for different kinds of prescriptions, patents, and all kinds of things. So I always felt like the music industry lacks a lot of that. And so that's been one of our big missions recently in the last year or two, is to just try to build up the level of research and information, because it's very hard to see the forest from the trees, to use the old saying, but there's oftentimes not a good place to find data on, let's say, music industry funding. So we created a music industry funding database. We're putting all of this into an information area. We just call it Pro. And underneath we have funding, IP information, research. And we're realizing, wow, this is stuff that not only does the industry need, but this is helping our reporting as well, because we have a much deeper look into these different areas. So I almost feel like that's where the industry needs to go, and hopefully we can help to build it a little bit more. This is so interesting because it depends, in my opinion, my crystal ball says it really depends on the specific subsector we're talking about. So if I am talking about, there's different terms for it, but I guess like incidental sort of sync music. So for shows like reality programming. Okay, so reality shows are series, they're cheaply produced, they go on and on and on with kind of a makeshift group of real characters, and every scene has to just sort of have some kind of music. It's got to have, tense background, it's got to have something that's upbeat. If there's some sort of big challenge, it's got to have something that matches that. I think that's the area that's going to be threatened the most, because half the time the music just has to work, and it works if the viewer really isn't paying too much attention to the music. So it's advancing the situation, the plot, keeping you engaged. That's important. On the other extreme, you would have someone like Hans Zimmer composing for Batman or something. That is going to come later if it comes, depending on how this whole thing shakes out. So there are going to be different impacts there. There's also already a lot of work that AI is doing to fill in the gaps for a lot of producers, lyricists. There's just a lot that AI is helping to do, even in ways you might not imagine. So on the EQ side, for example, or on the mastering side, there's a lot of work that AI can help there. So in subtle ways, unknown ways, different sectors might go away entirely. One area I think is going to be very, very difficult to replace, at least from the lens of our current culture and society, is the personality. And it's the celebrity behind music. And I don't think this gets enough attention, because it's not about the music entirely. So there is a phrase in the music industry that gets thrown around, which is, it's all about the music. I couldn't disagree more. Sometimes it's all about the music. In a chill hop playlist that I'm listening to just to tune out and get a research report done for my company or something, yeah, okay, that's about the music. It serves a specific function. For a workout, if I turn into a certain BPM and I want a high energy workout mix, okay, that's a lot about the music, but less so, because there's a personality involved there. There are lyrics. And then when you get into big personalities like Drake or The Weeknd, or Sam Smith, or John Mayer, whomever, I'm just rattling off huge names, it becomes about the personality. It's as much about the music as it is the personality. It's the affinity, the cultural affinity, the personality affinity. There are strange situations I've experienced as a music fan in which I feel like I know the celebrity singer singing. And of course, that singer does not know me. Okay? There is a connection and a glue there. And when you dig deeper, some of your best and and the people you revere the most sometimes in music are the most flawed and tragic figures you can imagine. So take as an example, not to pick on one tragic example, but like Jim Morrison of The Doors, okay? Died at 27, had an enormous problem with alcohol, having problems with his bandmates, wasn't even showing up to shows sometimes. It's sort of like out of control and tragic ending. But there's an affinity, there's a cultural icon there that I'm not sure if I could react the same way to, let's say, some of the Avatar artists that are coming out now. But then again, like I'm in my generation, I have my cultural cues, but it seems like that might be difficult to replace, if ever. So the landscape is going to be a lot more complicated than we imagine. Some things, yeah, may get flat out replaced, but it's hard to imagine the personality and the human glue getting replaced entirely by AI. Well, it depends what aspect though. So, okay, if you're creating a song, even if there's that celebrity glue, right? If there's a personality glue rather, okay, so the composition might be heavily written by AI. Okay, so this is gonna be one of those weird situations. I would say I could imagine myself having a connection to that artist and to that music, but it's gonna be heavily based on the personality, right? Because when you actually take a step back and you think, okay, what are all the songs I like? And when you boil it down, there's certain ingredients, and there's melody, there's gonna be a chord structure, there are key changes, key signatures, all these things. There's a structure, there's a chorus, a pre-chorus, instrumental breakdown. A lot of these elements are sort of, I wouldn't simplify them so much to say they're Lego blocks, but there are common elements that you find in every song. This is an aspect that tends to come up in these big copyright lawsuits, which is that one artist says, well, I just picked these elements and chord structures from here, and I didn't mean to make it exactly like that. So with that, sometimes I think maybe AI could come in and create some structures and melodies, harmonies in a song that, hey, maybe I'll react to. I don't know. Can it really make me emotionally, get me to emotionally react? Perhaps. For me, it's hard to picture without something human going on there. But that's just my attempt to predict this incredibly unpredictable future, if you ask me. Oh yeah, so I guess I want to leave it on this note. So we talked about artistry, all the nuances there, talked about some of the company, where I think the industry can grow and advance in the future. I would just say that if we pause and not look only at the business side and all the wonderful things that have happened in the music industry on the business side. So, for example, enormous flows of revenue on the recording side, which was a huge question mark even 10 years ago. What we're starting to see is genres, scenes, global artists emerge and blow up on a global scale to a degree that was basically unimaginable just 1 decade ago. So music used to be more regional, but there used to be such a gigantic, I was about to say ginormous impact coming from the creativity of certain countries and regions. So it would just be so heavily, the export of A&R would be so heavily based from like Sweden, United Kingdom, United States, Canada was on that list, maybe you'd have Australia on it as well. Like these powerhouses are just pumping out, and in many ways that's still the case. There's still an enormous amount of artists that, for example, come out of the United States. I get it. And going back to the history of music, so much in terms of music evolution has happened in many of those countries, right? Some of the best songwriters are still in Sweden. But now we're seeing so much music coming out of places like Colombia, Puerto Rico, South Korea, and just random places. You're seeing remixes happening between an artist in the United States, and then the Serbian producer like remixes it, and then boom, there we go. And then we've seen collaborations between France and Colombia. I'm thinking of specific examples here, but there's so much more that's happening on a global scale now. And there's, of course, stuff happening in Nigeria, like so many artists blowing up in Africa and all over the place. So it's exciting to think about, because Genres that have been around forever are suddenly exploding onto the national stage. You're seeing regional Mexican music exploding. Being from Los Angeles and always hearing that on a certain radio dial or in a certain area, I never imagined that was going to start emerging into more of a broad stage with a broader audience. But then again, I never would have thought that about reggaeton or anything like that. So it's just exploding, the creativity exploding, and it goes beyond the business. It's not really about the business as much as but it is about how we now have the ability to share, exchange, creatively, collaborate in ways we never did, and the results are unbelievable. And maybe we're just at the beginning of it. So I want to leave it at that. It's a very, very, very exciting time to be in this business.